Do you think you could have survived in 1348 if you had simply avoided the plague? Most people believe that rats and disease were the main threats of that time, but in reality, the most dangerous place was right inside the home. It was an ordinary medieval kitchen where every day turned into a battle. A modern person wouldn't last even 3 long days there. And it's not even about the unsanitary conditions, but the insane physical strain. Imagine your cozy modern kitchen with a microwave and a refrigerator. Now forget about that and welcome to a real hell. In 1348, the kitchen of a castle or a wealthy home resembled a factory. It was hot, dark, and incredibly dangerous to anyone's health. Your favorite weekend cooking will seem like child's play compared to this. But this is where all the strangest and most incredibly interesting things begin. Medieval cooks weren't the chubby, jolly figures from old children's fairy tales. They were tough people with iron muscles and countless scars. They worked under conditions that would violate every conceivable law today. Modern special forces could use this kitchen as a training camp. Sounds like a huge exaggeration, doesn't it? Let's break down why you'd be broken by evening. The first thing you'd encounter in a medieval kitchen is unbearable heat. The centerpiece of any home was an open hearth that burned almost around the clock. You couldn't just turn the fire off with the push of a convenient button. Rekindling it was so difficult that the embers were guarded like the apple of one's eye. The temperature in the room easily reached 40 degrees, even in the cold of winter. My shoulders start to sweat just thinking about it. This heat permeated absolutely everything around and turned the air into a thick substance. The kitchen walls had literally absorbed heat for centuries, giving it back even at night. The cooks had no way to step aside and cool off a bit. You were in that oven from early morning until late at night. Even in winter, people here wore light shirts that instantly became soaked. Modern chefs complain about the heat during the summer shift at a restaurant, but they have ventilation, powerful exhaust fans, and air conditioning in the dining room. In 1348, the only ventilation was a hole in the thatched or wooden roof. As a result, the room was constantly filled with thick, acrid, and very hot smoke. You would start coughing and choking after just 15 minutes of work. It was a veritable gas chamber that people voluntarily built in their homes. The smoke from the firewood settled as a black layer of soot on the ceiling, walls, and workers' faces. Their eyes watered constantly, and a lump of soot from inhalation constantly sat in their throats. If the wind wasn't blowing in the right direction, the smoke didn't escape outside at all. It simply circulated under the ceiling, sinking lower and lower toward the floor. At such moments, the cooks had to work literally on their knees to catch even a breath of fresh air. Carbon monoxide was the invisible killer of every medieval kitchen worker. Today, we install smoke detectors that start beeping at the slightest threat. Medieval people simply lived with constant headaches and chronic poisoning. They considered stinging eyes and nausea to be a normal state. Modern medicine would call this acute hypoxia and send you for treatment. But in the Middle Ages, you would simply have been slapped on the back of the head and told to get back to work. Few kitchen servants lived to a ripe old age under such conditions. Their lungs were so clogged with smoke that every breath eventually became a grueling ordeal. The constant lack of oxygen made people lethargic and irritable. But complaining was not the done thing, since working in the kitchen was considered a very prestigious and well-paying job. For a piece of bread and warmth, people were willing to sacrifice their health every day. Maintaining the fire was a separate and very arduous job in the kitchen. Young kitchen boys ran for firewood from the cold dawn until late at night. A large kitchen could burn up to several hundred kilograms of wood a day. And all of this had to be chopped, carried, and stacked properly by hand. Essentially, it was nonstop strength training and weightlifting. Modern trainers call this functional training, but back then it was just a Tuesday. The firewood had to be perfectly dry, otherwise the smoke would increase significantly. The boys had to keep an eye on the stock and bring new armfuls to the hearth in time. If the firewood ran out at the most critical moment, it was considered a real disaster. The responsibility fell on the youngest, and they were often punished for the slightest mistake. The entire rhythm of a huge castle depended on whether the next log was thrown on in time. But here's what's truly amazing about working with a medieval hearth. Cooks had to be able to create different temperature zones without thermometers. They moved the burning coals with a poker, forming areas for cooking and braising. This required incredible intuition and a thorough understanding of the physics of wood combustion. A mistake of just a couple of centimeters could burn an expensive cut of meat to a crisp. For spoiling the Lord's meal, cooks could literally be flogged. One had to know exactly which type of wood produced more heat and which produced more aromatic smoke. The cook gauged the temperature with the skin of his face or simply by holding his hand over the cauldron. This skill was passed down from teacher to apprentice over the years through practice and burns. There were no scales or digital displays, only experience and a keen instinct. Every cooking session was a unique experiment with an unpredictable outcome. The cookware used to prepare the food was also a real test of survival. Copper and iron pots weighed 10 kilograms even when completely empty. Now imagine that this pot is filled to the brim with boiling water. Lifting it off the fire required the strength of a professional and experienced weightlifter. One wrong move meant that boiling water would spill right onto your feet. There was no insurance or sick leave in the 14th century. Cauldrons were often suspended from massive chains over the fire and had to be swung back and forth. Working with such heavy weights in the heat and smoke quickly wore out even the strongest men. Cooks' fingers were often deformed from constantly lifting heavy loads. Over time, the skin on cooks' hands became as tough as the sole of an old boot. They could handle hot objects that would feel scorching to an ordinary person. But even such protection did not always save them from deep and painful injuries. Scars from splashes of hot fat covered the forearms of nearly every kitchen worker. These were a kind of medal for bravery, earned in the battle against the culinary elements. Fire also dictated the strict daily schedule of the entire fortress or estate. If the coals cooled overnight, the morning preparation of breakfast would be delayed by hours. Therefore, a special attendant was required to watch over the hearth all night long. Falling asleep on duty meant leaving dozens of people without a hot morning meal. It was like standing guard at a nuclear reactor, only with firewood. And the responsibility was just as serious, up to and including dismissal into the freezing cold. The night fire watchman had to rake the ashes in time to keep the heat inside. It was a tedious but vital job in the silence of the huge dark castle. Any spark could start a fire, so maximum vigilance was required. In those days, towns burned to the ground precisely because someone had fallen asleep in the kitchen. So this person was responsible not only for breakfast, but also for the lives of everyone asleep. Interestingly, the design of medieval hearths became increasingly sophisticated over time. People realized they could use reflective screens to direct the heat. They placed brick walls behind the fire so that the heat would flow toward the spit. Today, engineers use the same principle in modern energy-efficient ovens. Medieval cooks figured this out intuitively, simply trying not to freeze. They were true geniuses of thermodynamics, even though they didn't even know the word. Later, the first prototypes of chimneys appeared, which made life a little easier for those in the kitchen. People began to understand how draft works and how airflows can be controlled. These were important steps in the development of technologies that we take for granted today. Every tile in the oven and every bend in the pipe was the result of long observation. The kitchen transformed from a simple place for a fire into a complex engineering system. By the end of the first day by the fire, your lungs would be burning from the smoke. Your hands would be covered in blisters, and your back would be aching from the heavy firewood. You would dream of a cool shower and an incredibly soft bed. But in a medieval kitchen, work never ended at sunset. In the darkness, preparations began for the next endless and difficult day. And here we move on to the next huge problem for your survival. In the modern world, water magically appears from a shiny chrome faucet. You simply turn the handle, and the clear liquid flows in an endless stream. In 1348, every drop of water in the kitchen was earned through sweat and blood. To make soup, you first had to go to a well or a river. And this was no easy walk, but a trek carrying heavy wooden buckets. Your shoulders would be screaming in pain after just the third trip for water. The path to the water source was often muddy, slippery, and quite steep. You had to carry large quantities of water since it was needed for more than just cooking. Huge amounts were needed to wash the food, the floor, and the endless pile of dirty dishes. A single holiday dinner could use up several hundred liters of clean water. That meant dozens of trips back and forth under the scorching sun or in the pouring rain. But getting the water was only half of your new daunting problem. That water was teeming with bacteria, parasites, and other unpleasant surprises. People in the Middle Ages didn't know about microbes, but they understood cause and effect perfectly well. Drink raw water from a river, and you'd spend a week in terrible agony. That's why absolutely all water for drinking and cooking had to be boiled for a long time. This meant you had to gather even more firewood. Even well water wasn't always safe to drink raw. Sewage often seeped into the groundwater and contaminated the sources with diseases. People noticed that raw water caused unbearable stomach cramps. Boiling was the only available method of disinfection in those dark times. Because of the dangers of raw water, people back then drank ale or beer. And no, it wasn't a non-stop, lifelong drinking party. Medieval ale was very weak, containing about 2% alcohol. The fermentation process killed most dangerous bacteria, making the drink completely safe. Essentially, it was an ancient energy drink for replenishing burned calories. It just tasted like liquid bread with a slight smoky aftertaste. Absolutely everyone drank ale, from small children to the elderly and frail. It replaced water in the daily diet and provided the necessary strength for hard labor. Various herbs or even honey were often added for flavor, if the budget allowed. Without this drink, medieval civilization simply could not have existed. It was stored in huge wooden barrels, which also had to be cleaned and maintained. Washing dishes turned into a separate form of sophisticated medieval torture. You didn't have dish soap scented with fresh alpine meadows. Greasy pots were scrubbed with river sand, hearth ash, and bundles of grass. The ash, mixed with fat, formed a primitive but very caustic soap. It washed away dirt perfectly, but at the same time it corroded the skin on your hands until it bled. Modern dermatologists would faint at such an aggressive chemical peel. Cold water from the well could not dissolve the congealed fat from lamb or beef. They had to heat the water over a fire, wasting even more precious time and scarce firewood. Dishwashers spent hours hunched over tubs of hot, soapy sludge. It was the most thankless and arduous part of the work in the entire kitchen. By evening, their hands simply wouldn't straighten, and the skin on them turned bright red. The lack of clean running water greatly affected the preparation of meat and vegetables. Vegetables were often washed in the same water used for other purposes. That sounds absolutely disgusting to our modern sanitary sensibilities, doesn't it? But medieval cooks had to conserve water because it was hard to come by. That is precisely why most dishes underwent hours of heat treatment in hot ovens. Prolonged boiling was their only reliable protection against mass food poisoning. Cooks intuitively understood that long cooking times made food safer to eat. Even if the ingredients weren't the freshest, intense heat killed most parasites. Because of this, many dishes consisted of slow-simmered stews and thick soups. There were very few vitamins left in such food, but the risk of contracting something terrible was minimized. It was a compromise between taste and basic survival. In winter, fetching water turned into a real struggle for survival. Wells froze over and the ice had to be broken with heavy, long iron crowbars. Then the icy water had to be carried across the snow-covered yard straight to the kitchen. If you slipped and spilled water on yourself, that was the end of it. Hypothermia, in a world without antibiotics, often led to a swift and fatal outcome. Your office job with a free water cooler now seems like a true paradise. Your hands would freeze to the point where your fingers would stop responding and simply go numb. The metal buckets would burn with cold even through thick, coarse woolen mittens. Every step on the icy path could be your last successful move of the day. Winter was a time of constant fear and incredible strain on all human strength. Water, which in summer was simply a heavy burden, became a deadly threat in winter. The attitude toward hygiene in the kitchen was quite peculiar, yet logical. The cooks washed their hands but dried them on their own dirty cloth aprons. However, they knew full well that raw meat must not be placed near bread. They could not explain this from the scientific perspective of modern, sophisticated microbiology. They simply observed that after such proximity, people began to die rapidly. It was a brutal method of trial and error that cost thousands of human lives. Cats and dogs always lived in the kitchens, serving as a sort of sanitation crew. They ate scraps and leftovers that might otherwise rot quickly on the floor. Of course, having animals near food seems to us today to be the height of unsanitary conditions, but in those days it helped maintain relative order and keep rodents at bay. The cook had to maintain a balance of cleanliness in conditions where the very concept of hygiene did not yet exist. An interesting detail concerns the use of snow and ice in the kitchens of wealthy households. In winter, ice was harvested from rivers and stored in deep underground ice houses. This allowed wealthy lords to have a sort of refrigerator, even on hot summer days. Carrying blocks of ice was backbreaking labor that ruined the backs of young servants. Today, you press a button on the refrigerator and neat ice cubes drop out. In 1348, someone paid for those cubes with a ruined back and frostbite. These ice cellars were built using straw and sawdust for perfect thermal insulation. Fish or game could be stored in them for several weeks after a successful hunt. For the average peasant, such technology was beyond the realm of possibility and seemed like pure magic. Owning ice in the summer was considered a sign of extreme wealth and high social status. It required enormous resources and constant supervision by a staff of servants. So, you survived the struggle with fire and didn't get sick from the local river water. You've learned to haul heavy buckets and wash dishes with caustic hot ash. Perhaps you've even begun to take genuine pride in your newfound medieval stamina. But we haven't reached the scariest part of kitchen work yet. It's time to get acquainted with the butchery, where a real nightmare awaits you. In the Middle Ages, meat was a symbol of status, wealth, and a huge problem. Without electric refrigerators, preserving a carcass weighing 100 kilograms was a feat. If a lord slaughtered a cow, it had to be processed immediately, without a moment's hesitation. In a modern kitchen, you simply toss a steak in the freezer and forget about it. Here, however, the clock was ticking, and ravenous bacteria were already beginning their destructive work. The speed of meat processing was literally a matter of life and death for the entire castle. The main weapon in the fight against decay was ordinary coarse rock salt. The meat was layered with salt in huge wooden barrels to draw out the moisture. This process required physical strength, as the pieces had to be packed down tightly. Salt was incredibly expensive, so it was used very sparingly and with great care. An inexperienced kitchen boy could be beaten half to death for spilling a handful of salt. Today, salt is free in any cafe, but back then it was as essential to people as electricity. Smoking was the second most popular method for preserving meat during the long winter months. Hams were hung from the ceiling, where thick, acrid smoke from the hearth gathered. The smoke contained phenols and other chemical compounds that killed bacteria on the surface. The modern food industry uses liquid smoke from plastic bottles for flavor. Medieval people used real smoke to create a reliable antibacterial protective layer. They were practically food technologists, applying their complex knowledge to harsh practical conditions. Flies were constant, indestructible companions in any medieval kitchenwork area. In the summer, they swarmed around fresh meat in black, buzzing, and very unpleasant clouds. To protect the food, it was covered with a thick cloth or hidden in crates. But the flies still found cracks and laid their larvae in the precious food. Discovering maggots in a piece of expensive venison was a real disaster for the cook. It meant that the Lord's dinner was ruined and someone's head would soon roll. But here it gets even more interesting, because spoiled meat wasn't always thrown away. If the meat was only slightly spoiled, they tried to salvage it with the help of strong spices. Huge amounts of mustard, garlic, vinegar, and black pepper were used. Spicy sauces masked the unpleasant odor and helped the stomach digest the questionable product. Butchering a carcass was a bloody and physically exhausting spectacle for the faint of heart. Cooks used heavy iron cleavers to chop through bones and cartilage by hand. One inaccurate swing at the slippery meat, and you'd lose your fingers. Chainmail gloves for butchers simply didn't exist back then. Blood flooded the wooden tables, attracting even more insects and local rodents. Your modern vegetable cutting board is a sterile operating room compared to this. Every part of the animal was used, down to the last drop of blood. The blood was collected to make thick sausages and puddings, incredibly rich in iron. The intestines were thoroughly washed with river sand and used as casings for sausages. Thick broths were simmered from the bones for 2 or 3 long days. Even the hooves were put to use to produce natural animal gelatin and glue. It was the pinnacle of sustainable consumption that today's environmental activists dream of. Preparing elaborate dishes from small game was a true culinary nightmare. Imagine having to pluck and gut 100 small birds for a banquet. My fingers would cramp from the repetitive motions, and feathers would fly all over the kitchen. The tiny bones had to be carefully removed so that a distinguished guest wouldn't accidentally choke. Modern factories do this with machines in a fraction of a second without human intervention. You'd go mad by the 20th quail, and there were still 80 more to go. Fish days, prescribed by the strict church, brought their own unique culinary torments. Fresh fish had to be scaled with blunt, rusty knives. Salted cod, hard as a board, had to be soaked in water for several days. Then it was pounded with wooden mallets to make it at least somewhat chewable. The smell of rotting fish and old salt would eat into your clothes absolutely forever. Your favorite salmon roll has nothing in common with this torture. Now your hands are covered in knife cuts and burns from the pots. You smell of smoke, garlic, raw meat, and old stinky fish brine. You're ready to give up and beg for mercy from the incredibly harsh head chef. But you're sent to the bakery where a new phase of physical torture begins. Bread was the staple of life in the Middle Ages, but making it could kill you. Baking bread was a monumental task requiring extraordinary strength and incredible endurance. Dough was kneaded not in small bowls, but in giant, deep wooden troughs. To knead 50 kilograms of thick rye dough required powerful arms and a strong back. Often, bakers used not only their hands, but also their bare feet to knead. It's like a CrossFit workout that lasts 3 hours without a break. Modern dough mixers do this job in 10 minutes while the baker rests. Imagine this huge trough in which a viscous mass resists your every movement. Dough in those days was very dense, and kneading it to the right consistency was a real feat. Bakers would be drenched in sweat, literally battling the flour and water for hours on end. Every lump had to be broken down, and every layer had to be infused with air, using only their own muscle power. By the end of the kneading, a person felt as though they had single-handedly moved a small mountain. The bread oven was a massive stone structure resembling a dragon's lair. To heat it up, armfuls of firewood were thrown inside, and a roaring bright flame was kindled. Then the red-hot coals were shoveled out with iron shovels onto the stone, muddy floor of the kitchen. You stand before the heat-spewing maw, risking a burn on your face and singed eyebrows. The infrared radiation from the stones was so intense that it instantly dried out your eyes. It was a dangerous game with temperature, where there was no room for error. The oven stones absorbed heat for hours, turning into a massive energy reservoir capable of baking hundreds of loaves. When the coals were removed, a pure but scorching heat remained inside, capable of instantly turning the dough to ash. The baker had to work very quickly so as not to lose that precious heat, and at the same time, not get burned himself. The surface of the stone was so hot that the air around it literally shimmered and warped. Standing next to such an oven was like standing in the mouth of an active volcano. Flour in those distant times was far from the snow-white ideal found in supermarkets. The stone millstones were constantly wearing down, leaving fine, hard granite grit in the flour. Because of this, medieval bread felt like coarse sandpaper on the teeth. By the age of 40, most people's teeth were worn down almost to the gums. You would chew this bread and literally hear the stones crunching on your teeth. No modern dentist could save your smile after such a diet. This granite dust was everywhere, and it was practically impossible to get rid of it when sifting flour. Bread, which was considered the foundation of life, slowly but surely destroyed the health of every eater. People grew accustomed to the constant grinding on their teeth and considered it an integral part of the eating process. Pain while chewing was a constant companion of middle age, turning every meal into an ordeal. Your jaw was constantly working like a stone crusher, grinding hard grains along with particles from the mill. But stone dust was the least of your problems with the hard bread of that time. The real horror was ergot, a fungus that parasitized rye in wet years. This fungus contains alkaloids related to modern LSD and very potent natural poisons. Eating contaminated bread caused mass hallucinations and a burning pain in the limbs. Entire villages went mad after a failed harvest of rye gathered in the fields. People thought it was a curse from demons, but it was simply bad flour. The illness caused by this fungus was popularly known as St. Anthony's fire because of the unbearable burning sensation in the body. Tissues could begin to die off, and people literally lost parts of their bodies. The hallucinations were so vivid and terrifying that people saw monsters and angels in broad daylight. No one realized that the cause of these nightmares was the common black awn on a rye ear. Bread, which was supposed to give life, turned into a source of madness and agonizing death. The division of bread by social class took place right at the stage of baking. The whitest and purest wheat bread was intended exclusively for the table of a wealthy lord. Servants and kitchen workers were given coarse rye bread mixed with peas. The bottom burnt crust of the bread was often cut off and given to the poorest dogs. This is how the English phrase about the top crust came about, referring to high society and the wealthy. You would be guaranteed to eat the toughest and least tasty part of the huge round loaf. Wheat was an expensive and rare grain, so white bread was considered a true delicacy and a symbol of power. The poor, however, had to make do with dark, heavy bread that resembled a brick more than baked goods. They added just about anything to it, from bran to beans, to increase the volume of the loaf in any way possible. Often this bread was so hard that it had to be soaked in soup beforehand. The social divide between master and servant was clearly visible even in their plates. Trenchers were baked from old stale flour so that they would be as sturdy as possible and not fall apart from moisture. They absorbed excess fat, saving the tables and clothing of the nobility from stains and dirt. By the end of the feast, such a plate became the most calorie-dense part of the meal, having absorbed the finest aromas. For the poor, these leftovers were a luxurious gift that kept them from starving. Thus, bread served three functions at once, as tableware, food, and alms. Working at the oven required lightning-fast reflexes when loading and unloading the finished bread. Hundreds of loaves had to be placed in the oven using a long wooden shovel. If you hesitated, the first loaves would burn before you could put the last ones in. The baker had to perform hundreds of repetitive motions while constantly monitoring the shovel's position in space. The heat from the oven made it hard to concentrate, and sweat streamed into his eyes, making the work even more difficult. He needed a perfect sense of rhythm to ensure every loaf was in its place on time. Fatigue set in quickly, but the pace could not be slowed for even a second until the very last loaf. It was a true choreography in hell, where a single mistake meant starvation for the entire castle. Yeast in the dry form we're familiar with today, of course, didn't exist back then. Bakers used sourdough starter or beer foam, which they obtained from the local busy elves. This symbiotic bacterial culture required constant care, like a capricious pet. If the sourdough starter died from the cold, the entire baking process would come to a halt for several days. This meant disaster for the entire castle and severe punishment for the baker responsible. Today, microbiologists control these processes in laboratories, but back then, they relied on prayer. The starter had to be fed, protected from drafts, and kept in a warm place near the oven. An old piece of dough was passed from batch to batch, preserving the bread's unique flavor for many years. If a baker fell ill and forgot about his starter, he could lose his life's work. Restoring the necessary microflora was extremely difficult, and often they had to start from scratch. People believed that a special spirit of bread lived in the dough, helping it rise and bring joy to people. The baker's shift began long before dawn so that fresh bread could be served in the morning. Chronic sleep deprivation was an absolutely normal state of affairs for workers in a bustling medieval bakery. Their faces were always pale from the strain and gaunt from the hellish heat. You would have fled from there in tears, without waiting for the first morning shift to end. But ahead of us lies an analysis of the overall physical demands of this grueling kitchen. It's time to face the truth and assess your true muscular endurance. The night's work in the silence of the bakery was interrupted only by the crackling of firewood and the dull thuds of dough against wooden tables. While the entire castle was still asleep, the bakers were already hard at work battling the sticky dough and the scorching stone. By the time the Lord opened his eyes, warm, fragrant bread was already supposed to be on his table. This cycle repeated endlessly, day after day, year after year, with no days off or holidays. It was a life lived to the rhythm of an ever-hungry hearth that demanded more and more sacrifices. If you think that kitchen work doesn't require strength, you're wrong. The medieval kitchen was a place of extreme physical exertion for every unfortunate worker. All the cookware, tools and ingredients weighed several times more than their modern counterparts. Plastic and lightweight aluminum hadn't been invented yet, so heavy metals reigned supreme. Lifting a standard frying pan from that era was harder than lifting a modern dumbbell at the gym. You'd build biceps faster than any modern bodybuilder on expensive steroids. Cooks didn't have lightweight Teflon pans that could be tossed dramatically with one hand. Every movement required the tension of every muscle in the torso and arms. It was a life of constant physical exertion, where even the simple act of stirring soup became a workout. The heat scorched your face, your hands went numb from the constant effort, and your back ached terribly. Today, there are small electric motors that do all of this on their own. Back then, you were that very motor, working for a piece of stale bread. You had to maintain a strictly defined rotation speed so that the fat didn't just drip, but flowed over the meat. The cutting tables were made from massive oak trunks and never moved. Their surfaces had to be scraped with knives every day to remove ingrained grease and blood. This process alone burned hundreds of calories and required immense physical strength. Modern sanitary standards require the use of smooth surfaces made of high-quality stainless steel. They had only rough wood, which absorbed the entire culinary history. Cleaning such a table was like chopping firewood in terms of the energy it took. The wood cracked and formed deep grooves where bacteria multiplied and dirt accumulated. The cook had to literally scrub the table's surface with a stiff brush and sand. The fat from game seeped in so deeply that the table still smelled of meat even a week after butchering. It was an endless struggle for cleanliness in conditions that actively resisted that very cleanliness. Every morning began with this exhausting cleaning, which drained one's strength even before the main work began. Knives in the medieval kitchen deserve a special mention in our story of survival. They were made of carbon steel, which rusted incredibly quickly and dulled instantly. Cooks had to sharpen their knives several times a day on whetstones. A dull knife required more effort to cut, which led to dangerous injuries. Today, chefs cherish their Japanese knives as the greatest and most expensive treasures. Back then, a knife was a crude tool requiring constant, rough, and brute male strength. To cut through a piece of tough meat or a hard wheel of cheese, one had to lean into the knife with one's full body weight. Knife handles were simple and often uncomfortable, rubbing huge calluses into the palms. Sharpening a knife on a whetstone required special skill so as not to ruin the blade completely. The constant moisture in the kitchen caused the metal to become covered with rusty red spots after just a couple of hours. The knife was an extension of the cook's hand, but it was a very heavy and temperamental extension. Moving food supplies from the cellar to the kitchen was a daily grueling CrossFit workout. The sacks of grain weighed 50 kilograms each, and they were carried on frail shoulders. Barrels of ale and salted meat were rolled and hoisted using ropes. Strained backs and hernias were an absolutely normal occurrence among all the kitchen servants. No one paid attention to ergonomics or talked about proper lifting techniques. If you could carry a sack, you carried it until you dropped dead. The stairs to the cellars were narrow, steep, and often very slippery from dampness. One careless move with a heavy load could end in a fracture or something worse. The kitchen hands hauled these loads all day long, keeping the voracious castle running smoothly. There were no carts or lifts, only human tendons and bones. Young men were turned into hunched-over old men by the age of 25 from such strain. The cook's footwear also did nothing to promote the health and longevity of the joints in their weary legs. They wore leather shoes with flat soles and no proper cushioning. Standing in them for 15 hours on a stone floor was pure physical torture. Modern chefs wear special orthopedic clogs that save their knees and backs. Medieval cooks simply suffered from varicose veins and chronic pain in their worn-out joints. By the age of 30, their legs often looked like those of very old people. Water and grease often seeped into their shoes, making the skin soft and prone to fungal infections. The feet were the most vulnerable part of any kitchen worker, for without the ability to stand, they would lose their job. It was a silent but constant torment that accompanied a person throughout their entire life. Lighting in the kitchen was a separate problem, complicating every minute physical task. There were few windows, so the room was lit by the hearth's flames and smelly tallow candles. Tallow candles gave off a dim, flickering light and reeked horribly of burning animal fat. Working with sharp knives in the semi-darkness required maximum concentration and eye strain. Today, surgical lamps above chefs' work tables seem like a given to us. Back then, however, chefs worked almost blindly, relying solely on muscle memory. The soot from cheap candles settled on the food and made it just as hard to breathe as the smoke from the main fire. The corners of the kitchen were always shrouded in deep darkness, where rats could hide or food could spoil. To check if a dish was ready, it had to be held right up to the fire, risking a burn. The constant strain on their eyes meant that the cooks began to have trouble seeing up close at an early age. Evening work turned into a battle against the shadows, where every movement was potentially dangerous. The lack of cookbooks as we know them made the work even more nerve-wracking. The head chef kept all the proportions, timings, and temperatures exclusively in his sharp mind. He shouted orders at his assistants, and the slightest delay was punished with brutal and painful blows. This psychological strain, combined with the physical exhaustion, pushed people to their absolute limits. Modern tablets with recipe charts have completely and permanently eliminated this problem. In the Middle Ages, a sharp memory and obedience were the keys to culinary survival. One had to remember hundreds of nuances for each specific holiday or fast. If a cook forgot to add the right spice, it could cost him his job or even his freedom. Discipline in the kitchen resembled that of the military, where everyone knew their role and had no room for doubt. Any mistake by an assistant was considered a personal insult to the master and was immediately punished. Fear of punishment was the best incentive for a perfect memory and quick work. By the end of the shift, you would feel as if you'd been trampled by a herd. Your muscles would be burning with lactic acid, your lungs from the smoke, and your hands would ache. You would go to sleep right on a bale of straw in the corner of that same kitchen. And the worst part was that exactly 4 hours later, it would all start over again. It was an endless cycle of hard labor that you definitely wouldn't have been able to endure. To sum up, we can say one very important and harsh thing with certainty. The medieval kitchen was not just a place for preparing tasty everyday meals. It was a veritable industrial workshop that tested a person's physical and mental endurance. The history of cooking is often romanticized in movies and modern popular fantasy novels. We're shown merry feasts, roasted piglets, and cups brimming with sparkling red wine. But behind every such feast lay the superhuman labor of dozens of nameless kitchen heroes. They breathed in carbon monoxide, broke their backs, and burned their skin to feed the Lord. They knew nothing of microbiology, but their brutal methods saved entire cities from epidemics. They were engineers, chemists, and athletes, though they had no idea of it at the time. Your modern kitchen is a triumph of human laziness and ingenious technological thought. Rejoice in your refrigerator, love your microwave, and cherish clean running water. Surviving in the Middle Ages was too hard for us to ever want to go back.